A scroll keeper, one who was skilled in his knowledge of tribal law, came to Creator sets free, Jesus, to test him and trap him in his words. Wisdom keeper, he said, what path must I walk to have the life of the world to come that never fades away, full of beauty and harmony? He answered him, what is written in our tribal law about this? Tell me, how do you see it?
Well, welcome back to Searching the Sacred, everyone. Lisa, Steph, and Jason with you. And this season, we are stepping away from our normal wrestle and dance with different passages of sacred text. And instead, we're kind of zooming out and asking broader questions of what does it mean to have a sacred text? How do we read it? What does it say? These questions that Jesus was encouraging people to ask. And we've added to those questions over the course of our first couple of episodes. We've asked the question of what translation are you using? How did that translation come about? We've asked questions about how do you read it in community? Who's influencing how you read it? What's the context in which you've been reading it? As well as what does it say and how do you read it? And so today we're going to be diving in and exploring a little further of this sacred text that we call the Bible. And we're going to start by asking Lisa, what translation was that? Lisa?
Oh, that one was the First Nations version, which is an indigenous translation of the Bible.
I love the way that just sort of shakes some things up. And I actually think it was a really good one to read today, because today we wanted to talk about that second question of how do you read it that Jesus is asking there. But in this translation, the question was, how do you see it? And I actually think that is a good first question to ask related to the how do you read it, because how you see the text affects how you read the text and what kinds of questions you ask from it. So I'm thinking about different ways that people view what the Bible is and what the Bible's for, and how we then read it according to how we see it. Does that make sense?
Okay,
That's the question?
Yeah, it totally does. And I want to dive into that question, but can we also zoom out for just 1 second and recognize that when Jesus was saying, how do you read it? Or in the First Nations translation, how do you see it? It wasn't always a given that it was a scroll or it was written word, right? Throughout human history, most people are illiterate and they're not reading anything. So when you say, how do you see it? It very well could have actually been, how do you see the law? Where is it being lived out? Where is it being witnessed? Like, who's teaching you? Are they teaching you through word? Are they teaching you through teaching you how to read? Or are they teaching you through the way in which they live their life? Or is it through architecture, the shape of a building? Or is it through a painting? Like, how do you see the truth, right? We talked about truth versus fact last time. Like, how do you see the truth of the gospel or the truth of the scriptures lived out or put into practice or made aware to you? I actually think that word see is much bigger and carries different avenues for which how we know what God is up to or how we know what God is saying. I mean, what was Moses asked to do? Go stand in this crevice. I'm going to put my hand over you and then you get to see where I've been, right? That's how you know where the glory of the Lord is. Like, you get to see the results. Okay, all of creation is trying to tell us something.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm thinking about what you just said in the context that, like, this particular human who's asking Jesus this particular question would have access to the scrolls.
Right. True.
And even for that particular human, how he sees the scrolls is still going to affect how he reads the scrolls.
Right.
And then that's going to translate down to the other people. Yeah. Go ahead, Lisa. You got a thought.
It reminds me of like there's times when you are very seriously signing a document and then not so seriously signing a document. Like, like on your computer, you just check boxes and like, yeah, accept the terms and conditions, like, fine, get rid of it. But like, if you're signing like your mortgage, there are like, but in some ways too, like, depending on how much you're signing, you may stop even like reading. And then there's just other times where it like feels like, no, I want to read every detail before I sign this to make sure that I am not missing a thing. And so I think about it. Yeah, like, what is the text to you is going to greatly impact like how you read it. But I also think like how you think you understand it impacts how you read it as well. Because like there's some like in your mortgage document, you just kind of trust everybody's doing the right thing. You do not read that whole, like the stack of paper is like
It's too
the
much.
thick of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just like initial.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to think about. Yeah, are you co-signing the entire thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like in this case, does the expert already see himself as an expert, and therefore he has stopped reading it carefully? Would go along with the lines of what you're saying, or does he see himself as a learner who still has a lot to learn and is always still reading it carefully because of how much he still has to learn?
Or was, like, let's maybe it's less about his own ego or her ego, and more about like trust in the system that they were brought up in, because most of the scholars at this time, the teachers of the law, the scribes, they've been taught by a group of people. They've been instructed on how to do this thing, how to interpret this. I mean, we talk a lot about the work that we encourage, that 40 Orchards does with pastors and things like that. And most pastors have gone to seminary and been taught how to read the text a specific way. And whether we get taught that it's one way of understanding the text, the way of understanding the text, or a way of understanding the text, we've all been schooled to read it in some form or fashion. And so it's maybe not even about an ego of like, oh yeah, I've figured it out, I don't have to worry about thinking critically anymore. It could just be like, I'm really confident in the training I've gotten, and I trusted my teachers that the lens they were handing me was really beautiful and really, was accurate, as if accuracy was the goal, right? Or, so I don't know. It gets real interesting real fast.
I think maybe it helps to think of an example text here to think about both how we see it and then how we read it. So I'm thinking about the Exodus narrative and how there's this group of people who are slaves in Egypt who are freed from the empire and end up wandering in the wilderness before crossing over into a land. I had a tradition where I was taught to see that text is about history. So I would ask questions of that text that were historical in nature because that's how I saw it. So how I read it was, this is a narrative of an ancient people group who didn't yet have Jesus. And then I was seeing it as a pre-Jesus document that was a historical document. Now I see it as a text that says some things about the human experience and the human experience with the divine and the journey of what it is to leave narrow places and to wander as a part of finding our way. So I read it now with a different set of questions based on how I see it now as compared to how I saw it then. And I'm curious about other ways to see that narrative and therefore how we read that narrative according to how we see it. Because I think there's several to choose from when I think of different people over time reading that narrative. What else comes to mind for a way to see and read that narrative?
Well, for me, it's that Second Timothy passage. I think it's like 3:16 and 17, where it's like all scripture is God breathed and then useful for teaching, correcting, rebuking, training, in the ways of righteousness or something like that. I would have to look it up specifically, but it's that idea of it, like what Paul wrote of it being God breathed, me like, and the way that it was taught to me was, we don't have to question this because God breathed it. It came from on high. And so therefore don't question, don't get too curious. You're just here to learn because that's what it's here to do. It's useful for training, teaching, correcting, rebuking. And that was it. Period. Like, end of story. No question about, well, who's doing the teaching, whose interpretation, what translation, all those questions that we are encouraging people to wrestle with. None of that was ever brought into it. It was just, this is God's word. It was God breathed. And so therefore, like, we're good. Like,
Mhm.
now just get corrected and rebuked and trained, and then do the same thing to other people.
It's just kind of weird because the reality is, like, I get it. They decided this is the Bible and it was an open and shut edition. But like, if somebody were, let's say God decided to do something crazy. I don't know. God's done crazier things. But let's say
Do I
God
see
sent
somebody
somebody.
kicking up the tires of
Yeah,
heresy?
I'm just gonna play it out because I think because here's the thing: if who would we actually trust? Like, how would you decide? Like, if somebody was going to write about whatever thing it was, how would you trust that that's the person that's got it? Like, how would you identify? Like, who do you trust to tell a story?
Mhm.
Because it kind of feels like the people who are writing this stuff down and telling this, like the God breathed feels like a way of just saying we're trying our best. Like God didn't download it. It wasn't a transcript that dropped down. It just kind of feels like you're doing your best to tell the story.
Mm.
I think that probably pulls it down a little bit than what that's trying to say that it's doing. But it helps me remember that like there are things in the Bible that are like they go against each other or they don't quite make sense. Or I should be going like, that's surprising. Like,
Mhm.
what's happening there? Because that doesn't feel like that's like, yeah, humans
Mhm.
are flawed, but like there's something else going on. It's not that simple of a way of like just tossing it like, well, that's humans, they do that kind of thing. If
Mhm.
it's God breathed, if that's the story that's going to pull through.
Well, to me, I'm going to just stick with this passage for a bit here because the how do you see it, how do you read it question that you're asking there or seeing there is that you're seeing the text as connected to other parts of the text and other parts of human
Yeah.
history to say, how is it that there's this liberation story of the people leaving Egypt and being freed from slavery, and yet in another part of the Bible it talks about having slaves?
Mhm.
So you would see the text as a thing that needs to be read as a part of this whole and questioned in response to each other. That how does this liberation narrative go with something else that doesn't seem liberating? Who wrote it? How does that affect how I see the Bible? That both of those are there. So I hear how you're seeing and reading it in that question that you're asking of that
Yeah.
text. Is God a liberator or not?
Yeah. Well,
Because
you can't
sometimes.
really separate your lens.
Mhm,
Like you can't pull out the thing that you're naturally wired to do when it comes to I'm going to ask 1,000 questions.
mhm.
Because for me, like the worst case scenario, if the worst case scenario is that I go to hell, then I need to figure out what to do with that. If the worst case scenario, like how I understand all of it matters to, yeah, I want the thread.
I think
Mhm.
some people see something like okay, part of why I picked that narrative is that, like, every time we're doing a study on that passage, I reference like the Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt because some of those stories get seen as a story, as a thing that is for movies or for Sunday school. I know that story. Check. I'm done with that story. I already know that story. And I think a lot of people see the Bible that way. Like, what do I already know? So I don't have to read that again. I know that one. So then how I read it is something that I know. There's no more
Mm.
questions to ask of it anymore, which is very different from how you're reading it. There's always more questions to ask.
And wasn't taught that way. I mean, I would, you get
Mhm.
taught particular things even in like Sunday school. Like I'm a little bit out of the generation. We didn't have flannel graph, but we had like poster boards
Mhm.
of like the particular stories that Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah. Like there were certain stories that you were really fully immersed in, and you kind of know Daniel and the lion's den. There's
Mhm.
just things that you knew. So like you almost skip over it because you're like, well, yeah, I've been learning about that since I was 2.
Mhm.
But it's interesting when if you do go back to it and you try to read it with a fresh lens, you sometimes see things that you're like, wait, what happened? Like when you're like
Mhm.
Noah, and you pause and you're like, wait, everybody died? like, oh,
Mhm.
that's probably traumatic.
Mhm. Wait, that wasn't just a story about pairs of animals?
Questions now. What was what was on the boat? How did it work? And I like, but I still like. What's interesting though is I can say these things, but I do know that deep down I do treat it like it is. It is sacred in some ways, and it is sacred and special in a way that is connected to God. I don't know that I can explain it. So God breathed kind of helps me. It makes it feel connected to me, thinking about like the breath of God in us, that like our breath, and in the way that's interesting, like breath is automatic and happens. So I don't always I have to really think about it if I'm going to think about it.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of the same of the text. Like I can come at it in lots of different ways, but if I can pause and think deeply about it being something that God wants me to have and wrestle with, wants to know how I'm reading it,
Mhm.
then that feels different.
And I think it's important to note that that passage of it being God breathed and useful for certain things, we often just stop there. At least in my Christian training, we just stopped with like, okay, it's God breathed, it's useful for these things, end of story. The very next verse is a continuation of the thought, and it's basically like a therefore the believer or the person who follows this way can do every good work. So the goal is not to be right. The goal is not to have the correct posture towards scripture of it being elevated or lowered. The goal is to get to work and to be about like justice and healthy action and treating your neighbor with love and dignity and respect, like, and that's something the Bible has been wrestling with for literally its opening pages until its last page. Is how do we treat our neighbor? How do we respect creation or not? How do we, you know, treat people that are marginalized? Is there a preferential option for the poor or not, right? Which gets back to the Exodus story. And so when, like, what I appreciate is that what originally was, hey, don't question this because we're going to teach you what it says and we're right, and that's what this verse is saying. But it's actually like, hey, this whole thing has been discussed by the rabbis and by the storytellers and the teachers and the Jesus, and all of us have been wrestling with this because we're trying to figure out how to do good work in the world. Like, that's the point. The point is actually the question. The point is the wrestle, not simply that like somebody once said this is what it means and now we all just have to like get in line. That's actually really, really dangerous to do it that
Mhm.
way. um
Well, and that sort of like, are we reading it? If we're thinking about the question of how do you read it, are we reading it in order to assert power, or are we reading it in order to work towards justice? Like, what is our in order to? Is there
mhm.
often is something there. Is our pastor reading it in order to maintain the traditional interpretation that exists in that denomination, or is our pastor reading it in order to help the congregation live it out in the unique context of here and now? Like, we have in order tos, we have biases, we have, and so are we aware of those and how we're reading it?
Well, and I
Mm.
think, I mean, I this is the thing even about like pastors reading it. Like we have an assumption that pastors are teaching us the text, that that's part of the, but if you try to read the text with the idea that you're going to communicate something different, or like you're going to use it as the basis for communication, you're you're looking for a particular thing. It is why there are certain passages pastors don't really preach on,
Mhm,
because that stuff makes them sweaty to think about, like giving that as a sermon to like communicate it. But the
mhm.
Bible didn't care about getting sweaty. Like the Bible
I
encourages you to get sweaty.
I think that raises another one that I would put for how do you see it and how do you read it, is that how often we are seeing the Bible with a modern Western lens when it is an ancient Eastern document. I think that came up last time.
Okay, this is really cool because I was just looking up something and I've been holding on to this for like 3 episodes because I was listening to something a while back and I was like, "Ooh, I think this is going to play a part in this season."
You held on to it for.
I've been waiting. So, and
All
then
right, let's hear the
let me
wisdom
just
Okay.
drop. We're
let me
ready.
Okay.
just no no no. Let me
Now
just
you
let us
have
right
like
in.
elevated the game. Let's
I
go.
know, I know, I know, and hopefully it lives up to the hype. So, and we're going to talk theology later on in the season, like specifically like theological narratives, how we understand theology. But like one thing I wanted to offer, theology in its essence is like a pursuit of understanding or knowing God, right? It's the study of the divine. And that's necessary because we want to know. But there's this other train of thought that's called theopoetics. And it's seeing the pursuit of theology or the pursuit of God less as a scientific endeavor that we can actually solve and more as a poetic endeavor that we are invited to embody and join into. And so it's about process and it's about embodiment and it's about poetry and movement and flow and that's like interconnected to who God is and what God is and how God is and the Bible and scripture, as opposed to like the more Western enlightened idea of this is a textbook that we should just really understand and God is a equation that we should solve and Jesus is was a person that we should know everything about, and is historical and Noah's Ark is located here and here's the reason why the plagues happened, and like we try to get too scientific with it as opposed to just like letting it be this beautiful poetic artistic understanding of the unexplainable that we are invited to dance into.
Mhm.
And so the difference between theology and theopoetics could
Mhm.
be
That
something
makes
to
me think of like one of the things that irritates me about how people tend to read the New Testament is the desire to make the gospel synoptic instead of allowing them to be unique perspectives. So I feel like even there's this drive in theology to say, how do we make Mark and Matthew and Luke and John's perspectives line up with each other, instead of asking, why don't they line up with each other?
mm,
What is each of their unique perspective? How are they poetic in their approach as compared to scientific in their approach? What do we see in the differences and distinctions between these documents, instead of how do we reconcile them? Feels like a distinction between, are you reading it theologically or are you reading it how to say it again, theopoetically?
theopoetically.
um,
Okay, just I'm just gonna say, all I can see is my dad's face if you would say this to him. Like I like it because I can be on board with theopoetics, a poetic perspective. Um,
Mhm,
and I'm like there are some folks who are like, absolutely not, can't. And I think that's actually some of the beauty of the text. If we would allow it to be that we would allow, like, there are different ways to like read into it. There's different ways to understand it. And not that you have to necessarily pick a thing, but maybe try to step into other things to
mhm.
see what those might offer for you.
I think
Okay,
that's where it could be helpful. I was about to do a long thing, Jason. Do you have a short thing?
go ahead, do a long thing. Go, go, go.
Well, because I'm thinking about, we don't necessarily, when we're gathering, we use the word midrash from time to time here at 40 Orchards and Searching the Sacred, and there is a way of viewing midrash as something that has like 4 levels, and we don't in our groups like go in and like intentionally make sure we're using the 4 level. We don't use that as a scientific approach. We use it as a poetic approach. Are we learning to ask different kinds of questions of the text? And so we can put some of these layers in the show notes, but the idea is Peshat, what's a plain and simple layer, like facts, like dates, times, locations. Remez, what does this text hint at compared to how the whole text, like where does it hint towards other parts of the text? Daresh, seek, that's the root of the word midrash. What kinds of questions can you keep seeking into the text? And then Sud, which is about secret or mystery. What kind of mystical questions can you ask about it? Who God is, what the number 40 means, would be like mystical things. And I think that what happens is a lot of people get stuck at that Peshat layer, that like simple and plain layer. But even there, they're not really asking the questions of that layer that could be asked, because even the simple and plain things aren't always as simple and plain as they seem when you really actually dig into them. So the example I like to use of this is Genesis 12. Did I use this example in a previous episode? I used it recently, and I think it was with a group.
Nope, you used it in a different podcast.
Oh, I used it in a different podcast.
On.
Should I use a different? I thought I talked about a different passage. Maybe I can.
Can I offer one?
Yes.
Do you have one? Do you have one, Steph, or do you
a different example?
Yeah.
Do you have it? Are you about to jump in with an example? Is that why you asked?
I am. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, use your example. Use a different one.
Well, John, the Gospel of John, which is probably the most mystical and weird of all the Gospels that we usually don't try to get too scientific about, even though people do. One example where we do get scientific, at least in the evangelical tradition, is with John 3, where it talks about being born of the Spirit, as opposed to just being born of the flesh. And Nicodemus comes to Jesus and he's like, what's this all about? And Jesus is like, you need to be born anew. And he's like, am I supposed to go back up into my mother's womb? I'm an old man. That doesn't seem to make any sense. And Jesus just reiterates, yeah, you just need to be born again. And it's really confusing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And Jesus doesn't exactly solve the problem. He doesn't clean it up and make it easy for Nicodemus to understand. But the evangelical church sure has, right? Pray this prayer, come down to the altar, say this thing, have someone lay hands on you, and now we've solved John chapter 3, as opposed to entering into the mystery of being born anew and born of the Spirit. What the heck does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be born of the Spirit? And there is not clarity in the scriptures what that means. There's not a formula. It's not a paint by numbers. It's a, in the words of Benson Boone, mystical magical. Like, it is something other. Yeah, you're welcome.
You quoted 1 Timothy and Benson Boone, both in the same.
You're welcome.
Okay.
So, but to me, that's an example of this. We want to make everything solvable and clear and easy and paint by numbers, as opposed to like a Monet or a Picasso, and just letting it be like.
Okay, I'm gonna actually we're gonna stay in that passage, and I'm gonna ask 4 different layers of questions about that text.
Yeah.
So the Peshat layer, plain and simple. It's Jesus and it's Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Nicodemus is the name of a Pharisee. Nicodemus, though, is a Greek name that means conqueror, but he is a Jewish Pharisee, so why does he not have a Jewish name, a Hebrew name? And why does he have a Greek name that means conqueror when he is a Hebrew Pharisee? That is a plain and simple question that is not a plain and simple question. When you actually pause and look at the name, now we've got a whole bunch of questions popping about where did that name come from? Why is he meeting with Jesus in the middle of the night and not in the open? How does conquering have to do with the position the Pharisees now have in society? Like, plain and simple isn't just plain and simple. Remez, what does this hint to in other parts of the text? Well, Jesus is probably exasperated because in Deuteronomy 30, there's a whole conversation about the Israelites being born again. This actually isn't a new conversation. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. He should know what's happening in Deuteronomy 30 about being born again. If we follow that hint towards Deuteronomy 30, tie it to John 3, that starts to read a little bit different. Deresh, let's seek the next level of questions. Well, God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son. We like to quote that, but world is cosmos, the universe. How does the sending of Jesus save the universe? What kind of deeper questions can we ask about the salvation of the universe and our role in that? Sud, mystery. Now we get to the kind of questions you're asking about the mystery being born again. What is it to not try to solve that mystery, but to ask questions about the mystery? 4 layers of questions gets at a whole nother conversation about a well-known text.
For those listening on the podcast, brains are exploding.
I just did that really fast. I just asked a bunch of questions all in a row.
You didn't breathe very much while you said that.
No.
but you did get it out.
If anyone's listening to this on like like times 2 speed, they were like,
They slowed
whoa.
it down.
Slow it down.
15
Like,
seconds
let me
back, go back.
I need to rewind 2 minutes, turn it to like 1.25 and like really listen.
But it actually felt like to see those in a
Perfect.
row
Yeah.
is helpful to realize like, oh, I thought I knew this passage, but even the obvious things aren't as obvious as I thought they were. If we
Right.
if we see it as something that holds a lot, if we read it as a place that values our questions, that if we even in the Remez layer to say in that synoptic conversation, why is this conversation only in John and not in the others? What does this say about John's perspective and what John is trying to help us see about Jesus?
And to not elevate one over the other. They're all included.
Yeah.
All of the Gospels, right? This doesn't mean John is better. Also doesn't mean John's
Or that
worse.
John is like too woo-woo. We can't trust him.
What is John trying to say by sharing this story?
John does not, he's not in the synoptic gospels.
Mm-mm.
He doesn't get included.
We don't even try to reconcile him. We're like, John.
Fine.
And there's a beauty to like even separating out what we're doing, because what you're doing is really focused on the text itself, right? And like, what is the text saying and what questions can we raise from within the text? But then there's also this question that I think I was alluding to, which is a separate question of, well, what has your community taught you to do with this passage?
Mm-hmm.
Not don't worry about what the text says. What did your community tell you to do with John chapter 3? Be born again. Okay, I say the prayer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I get to go to heaven. Now when I read John chapter 3, I don't even have the capacity to ask any of the questions you just asked. I don't care who Nicodemus is. I don't care that he comes at night. I don't care that this is from Deuteronomy chapter 30 or there's an allusion to it. I don't care that it's a difference between being born of the flesh and born of the spirit, because I simply have to know that being born again means that I've said the prayer and I get to go to heaven. And now I get to move into John 3:16, which validates, because I've been taught how to read that too by my community,
Mm-hmm.
right? Throw out anything that maybe some of these yous and these pronouns are plural and not
Mm-hmm.
singular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for God so loved Jason, right? No, it's the
Mm-hmm.
whole cosmos, right? Like, it's not that God loved one person and one person's going to be saved at a time. It's that there's this whole thing being renewed. And so, but my tradition has taught me not to ask any of those questions and has already solved how I read this passage.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually really dangerous.
Do I read the Bible as something that solves things for me? Affects a lot about how I read it. If I look at it as a solution book, as a Google, then I want those narrow interpretations. That feels comforting because that's what I'm looking to the Bible for. Am I listening to only my tradition's voice? Am I listening to multiple voices? Am I doing this in community, or am I doing fill in the blank Bible studies? Am I trusting my pastor, or am I looking at other voices of authority as well? Like, all of that affects how we read it, how we see it, how we read it, where we go with it.
And some people may be wondering, well, okay, this is really complicated. Why do I have to do all this work? Why do I have to ask all these questions? Why do I have to look outside of my tradition? Okay, don't. That's fine. But if you're evaluating the Bible for, am I right or am I wrong? You're asking the wrong question, because the Bible is not trying to get you to sign up for being right. The Bible is trying to get you to be a more dynamic, loving neighbor and to do good work in the world. So the question you should be asking is the narrative that I've been handed, the lens through which I read this been handed, am I doing good work in the world? Like, what am I good news to the world? Like, and I don't mean just like my tribe or my people, but like the whole world. Is the whole world going to flourish because of the lens that I've been taught to read this? And if not, if it's more about defending power, if it's more about being right, if it's more about our tribe's right and your tribe's not, we're going to heaven and you're not, like, then you might have to ask yourself, okay, maybe the lens needs to change. Like, maybe there needs to be some other ways into this that Steph is inviting us into. Maybe there are better questions that I should be asking, because maybe I'm not as good a news as I thought I was.
Mm.
And now that might be really critical, and I'm okay with that.
Well, I think that the criticalness is, again, this does get at how we read it. Like, one of the ways that I read Jesus is it's not just about what he says. It's certainly not just about the fact that he dies. It's also what he does and how he does it, and that he is critiquing religious leaders because those who have access to the text are the ones who should know better. And so, how can we follow that example and do the same? If we have access to the text, what would Jesus call us out on right now? If Jesus dropped in to the modern Western church in the United States in 2025, where would he look at us the way he looks at the Pharisees and say, you have the text. How in the world are you reading the document this way? Like, woe to you. You should know better. Read it. What's there? How do you read it?
We better cut it off there, because that is a Pandora's box of a whole bunch of shit.
I want to hear a final word from Lisa, though. I feel like she had a thought that she didn't get to share.
I think I would, if you're using the text, like if you feel responsible to defend it, you probably have to do some wrestling. And if we're using it, I don't know. I was thinking about how it used to be really comforting that, like, there were just verses you could say when people are in grief. You got like 12 kind of in the back. You just pull one out when you need one, because they're so comforting. But when I think about it, I don't know that people are looking for a Bible verse when they're in grief. I think they're looking for people to walk alongside them. But I think we get nervous about how to be in relationship with people. So sometimes the Bible gets then used not for a defense mechanism, but almost like a safety mechanism to like, the God's going to do that. I can't do that. That's too much for me, or I don't feel comfortable, or if I say the wrong thing. So if I say a Bible verse, that's going to be the right thing. And so like, it's interesting to even just think about like your relationship with it and how it's morphed over time, and what are the things that you, why do you do the things you do with it? Is it because it was like just handed down, so it's the habit, or is it actually something you discovered was like, oh no, this is how I would do it. This is me. And I feel like so much stuff was like handed. And when I stop and think about it, I'm like, oh yeah. Cause like now I really don't want people throwing verses at me. Cause most of the time I'm like, well, do you know what context that's in? What are the verses surrounding it? You better like get straight with what you're doing. like it no longer can be that thing. So like, it's just an interesting, I don't know, as time goes on, I think this is where I'm like, gosh, we just got to get curious about each other. Like, how did you get there? Tell me more about like what you're thinking. Like, I want to just so understand how are you reading it? And I do think like Jesus is a curious human. And I think a lot of times like we kind of assume like he always knows the answer. Like he's asking a question because he knows the answer, because he's got hold of the rabbit hole. But what if Jesus is just genuinely curious of like, well, how are you reading it? How'd you get this? Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's a little like too soft on Jesus, but I think sometimes as humans, I need to remind myself to get curious. Because then once I understand how somebody got there, it makes things kind of make sense. Like, oh, okay, maybe that's tied to something super deeply personal and emotional. Mm-hmm. Maybe I don't need to be a jerk about it, and I could just let it be. And other times I might go, oh, that's harming you. Maybe we can work on finding something different. So that's what I'm thinking about. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's keep pondering those questions about how to not be a jerk and how to be curious as we
or maybe fiery and spirited like Jason. It's fine.
It all belongs. And we'll keep going with this series next week.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast, At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.